The Dakota Territory stretched endlessly under the late afternoon sun as 8-year-old Emma Clark stood at the edge of her family's small homestead, watching the horizon with growing anxiety. Her parents had left 3 days ago for the nearest trading post, promising to return by sunset yesterday. Now the shadows were growing long again, and Emma was down to her last piece of bread. She'd been brave for 3 days, tending the chickens, keeping the fire going, and rationing the meager food supplies her parents had left. But as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Emma faced the terrifying possibility that something had happened to prevent her parents' return. That's when she saw them, a line of riders approaching across the prairie, their silhouettes dark against the golden sky. At first, Emma's heart leaped with hope that her parents were finally coming home. But as the riders drew closer, she realized these weren't settlers in a wagon. These were Native American warriors on horseback, moving with the fluid grace of people who belonged to this vast landscape. Emma's first instinct was to run inside the cabin and bar the door, as her parents had taught her to do if strangers approached while they were away. But something made her pause. The riders weren't approaching with the speed or aggression of a war party. They moved slowly, deliberately, and when they stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, they made no threatening gestures. The leader of the group was a tall warrior with weathered features and intelligent dark eyes. He wore traditional dress with intricate beadwork, and his horse was a magnificent paint that stood perfectly still beneath him. The warrior studied Emma with an expression that was curious rather than hostile. For several minutes, they regarded each other across the distance, a small white girl in a worn calico dress, and a Lakota warrior surrounded by his companions. The silence stretched between them, filled with the tension of two worlds that had been taught to fear each other. But Emma, despite her youth, possessed something that many adults had lost: the ability to see beyond surface differences too, the humanity beneath. What she saw in the warrior's eyes wasn't menace or hatred, but something that surprised her: weariness and perhaps even sadness. More importantly, she recognized something else. The warrior's clothing, while beautiful, showed signs of hard travel. His horse's flanks were dusty and slightly sunken, suggesting days of riding with limited rest. Most tellingly, Emma's sharp young eyes noticed that neither the warrior nor his companions carried the bags and provisions that well-supplied travelers would have. They were hungry, she was certain of it. Emma looked down at the piece of bread in her small hands, a hard crust that represented her only remaining food until her parents returned. It wasn't much, certainly not enough to feed a group of warriors, but it was something, and something was better than nothing when people were hungry. Making a decision that would have terrified most adults, Emma began walking slowly toward the mounted warriors, the piece of bread held out in front of her like an offering. The warriors tensed slightly at her approach, but their leader held up a hand, signaling them to remain calm. Emma stopped about 10 feet from the warrior's horse, close enough to see the surprise in his dark eyes. "You can eat my last bread," Emma said clearly, her young voice carrying across the silent prairie. The words hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds. Behind the lead warrior, the entire tribal gathering watched in silence, their faces showing amazement at this unprecedented gesture. From a white child, subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories. You won't believe how this act of pure generosity changes everything. The warrior looked down at Emma for a long moment, his expression shifting from surprise to something deeper and more complex. Here was a white child, alone and vulnerable, offering her last food to people her culture had taught her to fear. The courage and generosity of the gesture was unprecedented in his experience. Slowly, the warrior dismounted from his horse and approached Emma. He was a tall man, and Emma had to crane her neck to look up at his face, but she didn't step back. Instead, she continued to hold out the bread with steady hands. The warrior knelt down to Emma's level, bringing his face closer to hers. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "Little one," he said gently, "this is your last food. Why do you offer it to strangers?" Emma considered the question with the serious thoughtfulness that children sometimes possess. "Because you look hungry," she said simply, "and because sharing food is what good people do." The warrior studied Emma's face, seeing in her young features a sincerity and kindness that reminded him powerfully of his own daughter, who had died in a cavalry attack 2 winters ago. The pain of that loss had hardened his heart against all white people, but this child's innocent generosity was creating cracks in his carefully maintained hatred. "What is your name, brave little one?" he asked. "Emma Clark." "What's yours?" "I am called Dakota by my people. It means friend to all." Emma smiled at this information. "That's a good name. Are you my friend, Dakota?" The question was so direct and innocent that it caught the warrior completely off guard. Behind him, his companions watched in fascination as their war leader, a man feared by enemies throughout the territory, found himself disarmed by an 8-year-old girl's simple question. I think I am," Dakota replied, surprising himself with the truth of it. Emma's smile widened. "Then you'll definitely share my bread with me. Friends always share." As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, Dakota realized he was facing a decision that would challenge everything he thought he knew about white settlers and their children. This little girl had just redefined friendship, courage, and generosity in ways that his years of warfare and hatred had never allowed him to consider. The piece of bread in Emma's outstretched hands represented more than food. It represented the possibility that understanding could exist between peoples who had been enemies, and that sometimes the greatest wisdom came from the most unexpected sources. As Dakota looked at the piece of bread in Emma's small hands, he felt something shift inside his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. The possibility of hope. This white child's offer represented more than simple generosity. It was a gesture that challenged every assumption he'd made about the settlers who had invaded his people's lands. "Emma," Dakota said gently, still kneeling at her level, "I cannot take your last food. You need it more than we do." Emma tilted her head, considering this with the practical logic that children often possessed. "But there are more of you than me, and sharing makes food go further somehow. My mama always says that." Behind Dakota, the other warriors watched this extraordinary exchange with growing amazement. Their leader, a man who had fought cavalry, soldiers, and settler militias for years, was being taught about generosity by a child young enough to be his granddaughter. "Where are your parents, little Emma?" Dakota asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They went to the trading post 3 days ago. They should have been back yesterday." Emma's voice remained steady, but Dakota could hear the underlying worry. "I think maybe their wagon broke or something." Dakota understood immediately what had happened. The trading post was 40 miles away, and the recent heavy rains had turned the creek crossings into dangerous torrents. Emma's parents were probably stranded somewhere, unable to return until the water levels dropped. "Emma," Dakota said carefully, "are you alone here?" "Yes, but I'm not scared." Emma replied with the kind of bravery that came from having no choice. "But to be brave, I can take care of myself. I've been doing it for 3 days." Dakota looked around the small homestead, taking in the well-tended garden, the properly maintained chicken coop, and the neat stack of firewood that suggested Emma had indeed been caring for everything herself. The sight of this small child managing such responsibilities filled him with a mixture of admiration and protective concern. One of the younger warriors, a man named Chayton, rode forward and spoke to Dakota in their native language. From his tone and gestures, Emma could tell he was arguing about something, though she couldn't understand the words. "What is he saying?" Emma asked with the directness that only children possessed. Dakota was quiet for a moment, translating not just the words, but the complex emotions behind them. "He says we should not trust white settlers, even small ones. He says this could be a trap." Emma looked up at Chayton with serious eyes. "I'm 8 years old," she said matter-of-factly. "I don't know how to make traps. I only know how to share bread." The simple honesty of her response seemed to affect Chayton, whose expression softened slightly despite his obvious suspicions. "Emma," Dakota said, "my people and your people have been at war for many years. Many of my friends have died fighting your soldiers. Many of your people have died in our raids. Why should we trust each other?" Emma considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know about wars and soldiers," she said finally. "I only know that you look hungry and I have food." That seems more important than being scared of each other. Subscribe to our channel now. The wisdom this young girl shares will challenge everything you think you know about conflict and understanding. Dakota felt something crack inside his carefully guarded heart. This child's simple philosophy was more profound than all the war, councils, and peace negotiations he'd ever attended. She had reduced the complex conflicts between their peoples to a basic human truth. When someone is hungry and you have food, you share. Emma, Dakota said, making a decision that would have surprised his warriors. If you truly wish to share your bread, then we will share it together. But first, we will share what we have with you. He gestured to one of his companions who rode forward and dismounted. From his pack, the warrior produced a bundle of dried meat and some berries wrapped in soft leather. This is pemmican, Dakota explained to Emma. It will keep you strong until your parents return. Emma's eyes widened with delight. Really, you'll share your food with me too. Friends share, Dakota said, using Emma's own words back to her. Is this not what you said? As the sun began to set, an extraordinary scene unfolded on the Dakota prairie. A group of Lakota warriors and a small white girl sat together around Emma's family's fire, sharing food and beginning to understand that the humanity they shared was more important than the differences that divided them. Emma broke her piece of bread into small portions, giving each warrior a piece while they shared their provisions with her. The portions were tiny, but the significance of the gesture was enormous. Emma, Dakota said as they ate, "You have taught me something important today. You have shown me that courage is not always about fighting. Sometimes it is about offering kindness when you have every reason to be afraid." My mama says that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, Emma replied. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. Chayton, who had been the most suspicious of the warriors, spoke up in halting English. "Little one, you are very wise." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Dakota made another decision that would have surprised anyone who knew his reputation. As a fierce war leader, "Emma," he said, "your parents may not return for several days. You should not be alone here. We will stay nearby until they come back to make sure you are safe." Emma's face lit up with joy. "Really? You'll stay and be my friends? We will stay," Dakota confirmed. "And yes, little Emma, we will be your friends." That night, as Emma slept safely in her family's cabin, Dakota sat by the fire with his warriors and contemplated how one small girl's act of generosity had begun to heal wounds that years of warfare had created. The piece of bread she'd offered had been tiny, but its impact was immeasurable. For the first time in years, Dakota found himself believing that peace between their peoples might actually be possible. 3 days later, Emma's parents returned to find a scene that would have been impossible to imagine when they'd left for the trading post. Their 8-year-old daughter was teaching a group of Lakota warriors how to play a clapping game. While the warriors were showing her how to weave grass into small baskets, John and Mary Clark sat in their wagon at the edge of their property, trying to process what they were seeing. Their daughter, who should have been terrified and hiding, was laughing and chatting with Native American men as if they were old family friends. "Emma," Mary called out, her voice tight with fear and confusion. Emma looked up from her game and ran toward the wagon with obvious joy. "Mama, Papa, you're back. I want you to meet my friends." John Clark reached for the rifle in his wagon, but something in his daughter's demeanor made him pause. Emma wasn't acting like a child who'd been terrorized or threatened. She was acting like a child who'd made new friends. Dakota stood slowly, recognizing the moment of crisis that had arrived. How Emma's parents reacted would determine whether the fragile understanding they'd built would survive or be destroyed by fear and misunderstanding. "Mama, Papa," Emma said, taking her parents' hands and leading them toward the warriors. "This is Dakota. He's my friend. He stayed to protect me while you were gone." John and Mary looked at the tall Lakota warrior with a mixture of fear and confusion. Everything they'd been taught about Native Americans suggested the situation should be dangerous, but their daughter's obvious comfort and affection for these men challenged all their assumptions. "Mr. and Mrs. Clark," Dakota said in careful English, "your daughter is very brave. She offered her last food to strangers when she thought we were hungry. She taught us about friendship Mary knelt down to Emma's level. "Sweetheart, are you all right? Did anyone hurt you?" "Of course I'm all right," Emma replied with 8-year-old logic. "Dakota and his friends took care of me. They shared their food with me, and they taught me songs, and they made sure I wasn't scared at night." John studied Dakota's face, trying to reconcile his preconceptions with the reality before him. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why did you help our daughter?" Dakota's answer was as honest as Emma's offer had been 3 days earlier. "Because she showed us that kindness is stronger than fear. Because she reminded us that children are precious, no matter what color their skin. Because she taught us that enemies can become friends when they choose to see each other's humanity." Mary was still struggling to understand. But we are Lakota, yes," Dakota said gently, "and you are white settlers. Our peoples have been at war. But your daughter showed us that war is a choice, just as peace is a choice." Emma, sensing the tension in her parents, spoke up with the wisdom that had impressed the warriors. "Mama, they're just people like us. They get hungry and tired and sad, and they love their children just like you love me." Subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories. You won't believe how this little girl's wisdom transforms an entire community. Over the next hour, a remarkable conversation unfolded as Dakota shared his own story with Emma's parents. He told them about losing his daughter in a cavalry attack, about his years of anger and hatred, and about how Emma's simple act of generosity had begun to heal wounds he'd thought were permanent. "Your daughter gave us more than bread," Dakota explained. "She gave us hope that our peoples might someday live in peace." John Clark, a practical man who'd come west to build a better life for his family, found himself considering possibilities he'd never imagined. What would that look like? Peace between our peoples, small steps. Dakota replied, using words Emma had taught him: trade instead of raids, sharing knowledge instead of fighting over land, teaching our children to see each other as neighbors instead of enemies. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more riders, this time a group of settlers from nearby homesteads who'd heard about the presence of Native Americans and had come expecting to find trouble. John called out Tom Henderson, the leader of the group. "We came as soon as we heard. Are you folks all right?" The settlers rode up with weapons ready, clearly prepared for a fight. But what they found was Emma sitting comfortably next to Dakota, while both groups of adults talked peacefully round the fire. "We're fine, Tom," John said carefully. "Better than fine, actually. These men helped protect Emma while we were gone." The newcomers looked confused and suspicious. This wasn't the scene they'd expected to find. Emma, with the social confidence that only children possessed, stood up and addressed the group of armed settlers. "These are my friends," she announced clearly. "They shared their food with me and kept me safe. If you're going to be mean to them, then you're not my friends." The simple declaration from an 8-year-old girl carried more moral authority than any adult argument could have. The settlers found themselves disarmed by Emma's directness and obvious affection for the warriors. What followed was the most unlikely peace conference in Dakota Territory history. Sitting around a homesteader's fire, white settlers and Lakota warriors began to discuss the possibility of coexistence, trade relationships, and mutual protection agreements. The conversation wasn't easy. There were decades of mistrust and violence to overcome. But Emma's example had created an opening for dialogue that might never have existed otherwise. "You know," Tom Henderson said eventually, looking at Dakota, "my cattle have been getting through your winter range. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement that benefits both our peoples. And we know where the best water sources are during dry seasons," Dakota replied. "Information that could help your crops survive." 6 months later, the Clark homestead had become an unofficial trading post and meeting ground where settlers and Native Americans could interact peacefully. Emma's act of sharing her last bread had grown into a network of cooperation that benefited both communities. The little girl who had offered her last bread to a hungry warrior had become a bridge between two worlds, proving that sometimes the most profound changes began with the simplest acts of human kindness. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of courage, generosity, and building bridges across divides from the American frontier. Hit that subscribe button now because these tales prove that one person's kindness can change the world. On Emma's 9th birthday, Dakota arrived with a special gift, a beautiful beaded necklace made by the women of his tribe. As he placed it around her neck, he said something that would stay with Emma for the rest of her life. "Little friend," he said, "you taught us that the bravest thing anyone can do is offer kindness to a stranger. Because of you, our children will grow up knowing that friendship is possible between all peoples." Emma smiled up at the warrior who had become like a grandfather to her. "You taught me something too, Dakota. You taught me that being different on the outside doesn't matter if you're the same on the inside." As the sun set over the Dakota Prairie, Emma Clark stood between two worlds that had learned to see each other as neighbors rather than enemies. All because one small girl had been brave enough to share her last bread with strangers who looked different but were hungry just like she was. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these incredible tales of frontier bridge building and cross-cultural friendship to life. Subscribe now and join us for more amazing stories that prove love and kindness can overcome any divide.